need that. And it's my good morning, everybody. And I want to thank Jerry and Michelle. I feel those of you of a certain age may remember the Sonny and Cher hour on TV. I sort of feel like I'm like the first guest invited on after the big opening number, like Rip Torn maybe, or Perry Como. It's Christmas season. I'll be Perry Como. I can live with that. I also want to thank Laura, some of my other friends with Creative Mornings, Laris Kreslins and Laura Silverman, sitting right here in the front, for inviting me to be here. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here talking to you today about silence. No one's ever asked me to talk about silence before. You'll soon see why. When Laris asked me to start this, to give this talk, I thought, at first I thought, okay, silence, it's December, it's near the solstice, everyone needs silence in their life. I sort of I started on a very sort of wide and predictable path of thinking about meditation, reflectiveness. But very quickly in thinking about this, I was brought back to a conversation I had that Laris was involved with at the library company about 2 years ago, where we talked about silence as one of Franklin's virtues. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But the conversation was a wonderful conversation because it came around eventually to the idea that this tension within the idea of silence. On the one hand, none of us have enough silence. None of us have enough time to spend actually thinking and reflecting. The first place this conversation often goes is, with the Twitter and the texting and all the media, we don't have any silence, which is all true. But we also live in a moment, I think in this particular moment in history, we live in a time when speaking up, whether you're a whistleblower, whether you're part of the Me Too movement, all of these things about having a voice, participating in a broader civic conversation are especially important. And so I think the overall tension in my reflections on silence and in what I'm going to say today is trying to find that balance between the silence that's necessary for reflection and regeneration, the silence that's necessary for listening, but also the opposite of silence. How does silence exist in this tension with the need to speak and the need to be heard? There's no quick answer to this, but I think that very tension, for me, has been a really wonderful point of reflection at this time of year. We'll get there. I want to talk a little bit about the library company because chances are most of you have never heard of it, and it is really cool, like Michelle said. So the library company was the first public library, full stop. It was the first lending library, and it was established here in Philadelphia by Ben Franklin and his CreativeMornings team, also known as the Junto. Franklin, Franklin, born in Boston, comes to Philadelphia. Within about a year of being here, he meets a guy who has this great deal for him. He was actually the governor of Pennsylvania, who says to Franklin, hey, you're a smart young man who knows how to print things, and I'm the governor. Why don't I send you to London, have you buy a used printing press and some type, you'll come back to Philadelphia, we'll make beautiful music together. Franklin goes on the next ship to London. As he's getting off, he goes to the captain and says, by the way, Governor Keimer said that I had letters of introduction and letters of credit for him so I could go meet people and buy my printing press. And the captain said, I have no letters for you. I have nothing for you. The governor didn't give me anything. And it seems like Franklin was just sort of punked on a grand scale, who knows why, by the governor. Franklin he has no money. He ends up spending a year and a half in London, basically trying to earn his fare back. But also, he's grown up in Boston, this puritanical city of about 15,000 people, literally puritanical, right? And so now he's in London, which is like the most busy, energetic, creative metropole in the world at the time. And for him, a voracious reader, a voracious thinker, a voracious talker, the experience of being in London changed his life. And so he comes back to Philadelphia to try to establish himself in business for real this time. And he's seen too much of the big city. And the first thing he does, he organizes a group of 12 people, 12 men. And every Friday night, they're called the Junto. Every Friday night, they meet at a tavern at 3rd and Market Street. And they talk about the issues of the day. and they talk about business. It's part Chamber of Commerce, it's part drinking society, it's part book group, it's part therapy session, but they get together and they start to come up with civic improvement projects. And one of the first ones they come up with is a library. The idea is that in their conversations, which often are about political history, government, philosophy, they're often referring to books. And each one of them owns a couple of books, because books are expensive and they have to be imported. So Franklin has the idea, okay, what if we all took our books and brought them together, and then we could borrow the books from each other and return them, and we'd have a nice little library for the group. This doesn't work. As anyone who's ever lent books to anyone will tell you, they don't come back. And so the library, that was Library 1.0. Library 2.0 was, okay, what if we get 50 people in the city of Philadelphia, which at the time was a city of 13,000 people, on the frontier of the wilderness. What if we can get 50 people to kick in 40 shillings each? And with that money that we build, we will buy books from London. And we will start, and if you are a shareholder who kicked in your 40 shillings, you can borrow the books. And then if you don't return the books, you have to pay a fine. And 288 years later, the library company still exists. I tell people that Franklin invented the public library, and that was the library company. But really, what Franklin invented was the library fine, which famously is now being eliminated, thank goodness, here in Philadelphia. So the library company today is a research library. We were Philadelphia's main public library. Franklin was very proud of the idea of the library company. And it quickly proliferated as an idea throughout the colonies. Every major city, within a couple of years, developed its own library like this. And it became the type of public libraries that followed. It became Philadelphia's main public library for most of its history. And by the time of the Civil War, it was one of the 5 largest libraries in the country. Then in the 1890s, the idea of municipally funded public libraries starts to emerge. The Free Library of Philadelphia opens in the 1890s. I used to work for the Free Library, and people would sometimes ask me, why is it called the Free Library? Aren't all public libraries free? The reason it was called the Free Library was because it described its significant competitive advantage vis-a-vis the library company, which lent its books only to shareholders or to people who put down a deposit. You could use the books for free at the library company, but you could only borrow them if you put money down or if you were a shareholder. So with the development of the Free Library, the library company no longer had a sort of reason for being. And it took about 60 years to figure that its business model had been undermined. So in the 1950s, it became a research library. They closed the stacks. And it's now available to anyone who wants to use the collections. We don't circulate books anymore, but we have a steady traffic of researchers. Most of what we do now, we give out a lot of fellowships to scholars who want to use our collections to research what life was like in America in the 18th century and 19th century. That's a library company. I probably did more on that than I meant to, but young Ben Franklin, around the same age. This was young, rich Ben Franklin. Franklin made most of his money shortly after he started the library company when he got the government contracts to print for the colony. Franklin literally printed money. That was how he made his money, was he printed the money for the Pennsylvania colony. He did a cool thing when he was printing money. As part of his junto group, there was a member of the junto group who was something of a naturalist. He would go out and walk around Philadelphia and gather leaves. And then he would print the leaves the way maybe your kindergartner would print leaves, but they're really beautiful. A man, his name was William Brightnall, and he would print these spectacular images of leaves with every pore and every vein showing. And Franklin looked at that idea, and he was so good at appropriating other people's ideas and literally monetizing them. And he took this leaf and he said, you know what, that actually would be a really good anti-counterfeiting measure. So on my bills, I'm going to print images of leaves, because the pattern of leaves, the pattern of their veins, the pattern of shape is only God can, as Joyce Kilmer told us, only God can make a leaf, only God can make a tree. This became why his money, this was the anti-counterfeiting measure, was instead of printing dead people on his currency or national symbols, he had leaves. It's interesting. This is a picture of the library company as it looked. The library company was the first Library of Congress. When the first Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in the 1770s, the Second Continental Congress, they met at Carpenter's Hall. This is not Carpenter's Hall. But they met at Carpenter's Hall, and they met And upstairs, the library company was upstairs. And delegates to those conventions got circulation privileges at the library company. Then when the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in the 1780s, they used the library company as their library. And when the national government was here from 1790 to 1800, again, they served Congress and the executive branch. They had circulation privileges. When government finally moved to DC in 1800, Congress liked having a library of its own so much that they decided to build the Library of Congress. No deliberative body had had a library before that, but it was the library company's role in serving the needs of the Congress and of the founders that set this idea of, well, we had this great library in Philadelphia, let's build one in Washington, which is now the Library of Congress. I like to think of the library company as being the source of the sort of in some ways providing the intellectual ground on which the Constitution and the Declaration were written. If you were a delegate and you wanted to brush up on your Locke and your Rousseau and your Hume, the basic political concepts on which these documents are written, you borrowed your book, you got your sort of refresher from the library company books. I love thinking about that role, especially today when we're all worried about the future of our democracy and the principles on which it's founded. The question I'm always asking myself, and this is coming back to silence in a moment, is how does the library company reappropriate that role as being sort of the intellectual wellspring of American democracy? How do we use our resources, our scholars, our books, our ideas, our history as a way of reminding people what it means to be a citizen? So I say civic literacy. And part of silence, sort of the other side of silence is listening, right? And I think it's around those ideas that I want to start to pull us back and think about that balance again between silence as reflection, but also what about our need to speak? How do we value silence when we have such an urgent need to speak and be heard? So 2 years ago, when I started at the library company, I was very lucky in that the 92nd Street Y up in New York was starting at the very same time a national program called the Franklin Circles Program. It was somebody's idea at the 92nd Street Y to take the 13 virtues that Franklin sketched out, or that he described in his autobiography, and to have talking groups all around in every neighborhood in town, all talking about the modern relevance of Franklin's virtues. It's kind of an odd project, really. And we met, I led one, as soon as I found out about this, I'm like, oh, the library company has to be on this. We are Ben Franklin's library. And so I convened a group that met 13 times over 13 months to talk about each one of these virtues. I have some pictures, I have some pictures from the rollout, but the one, of course, I want to talk about today is silence. And this is what Franklin has to say about silence. Speak not, but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. This, like so many of Franklin's virtues, it has that sort of, it's good advice, right? But when we started talking about this at our Franklin Circle, a couple of ideas like this sort of mandala-like set of contradictions started to emerge really quickly. The Franklin Circles idea, let me show you some pictures. I want to show you these. These are, by the way, Steve Weineck pictures. Weineck? Steve? Thank you, Steve. Sorry. Steve took these pictures for us. This was a couple of years ago. So we had people gathering around at the library company talking about these virtues. We had this guy talking about something he knows well, temperance. This was our silence guy. We spent a lot of time talking about that. I'm going to go back to Dr. Franklin here and his idea. Oh, I should be pointing it the wrong way. So, like a lot of Franklin's virtues, once you start to sort of scratch at them, you realize there's something very strategic and self-advancing about them. In reading Franklin, you often feel this tension between this very altruistic and noble side of Franklin that wants to improve. This is in some ways the best thing about Franklin, is he really believed in the importance of self-improvement. The junto was a self-improvement society. But it also means that his words of advice like this always have that little undertow of self-interest around them. Speak not, but what may benefit others or yourself. right? There's always that little hook to it that's like, oh, this isn't just about like, these aren't the Beatitudes. This isn't, Jesus talking to us. This is Franklin, who's really pragmatic. He's not saying it is virtuous in and of itself to listen and let others speak. It's only talk when it benefits you or other people, in the other order. Avoid trifling conversation. When we started talking about silence, there were a number of Quakers in the group, practicing Quakers, and they said, well, they started on the path of silence is about reflection. Silence is about becoming in touch with your inner self. Silence is a meditative and reflective practice. But that's not what Franklin is talking about. And we started to make this distinction between the reflective, what I'm sort of calling the Quaker silence, right? Or the Zen silence, the meditative silence, the sort of spiritual silence, right? Versus the sort of Franklinian silence, which is kind of tactical. I should say Franklin himself was not known as a very good public speaker. He didn't like public speaking. There aren't a lot of records, you won't, in reading about Franklin's life, you won't hear a lot of conversation about, he gave this amazing speech in front of the Congress. He didn't give a lot of speeches because he didn't like speaking that much. And when his really top skills were as a diplomat and as an organizer. And he found there that it was really most important for him to sit back, let other people talk, watch the way the conversation is going, and then at the critical moment would jump in as like the elder statesman. Accounts of the Constitutional Convention describe Franklin, who was much older than the other delegates, doing exactly this, hanging back, waiting for his time, and talking. You get a sense in reading the autobiography, this was not easy for Franklin to do. He always had something to say. He knew he was the smartest person in the room. But this is why silence, that if you ever read the biography and autobiography, and I'd recommend it, these 13 virtues, the autobiography is sort of America's first great self-help book. And he lists these 13 virtues, and he even sort of gives you a grid in which you're supposed to record how well you do on each virtue during the week. So on Tuesday, temperance, no. Low score for temperance on Tuesday, high score for silence. So there's a whole, he really provides a whole method and a process by which you're supposed to meditate on these virtues and use them to improve your life. But in Franklin's case, it's really silence as a diplomatic and strategic tool. And as we talked about this in our Franklin circle, we began to, there was one person in our group who was like, look, there's too much going on in the world right now. I'm too worried about our government. I'm too worried about, this is my example of Quaker silence. Let us silence so we can hear the whisper of God. There's too much going on. I can't afford to be silent. We can't afford to be silent. And it was sort of an agree to disagree moment in the middle of this conversation about I can't really get into this conversation about the virtue of silence when there's so much that needs to be addressed. I also started thinking about Hamilton, right? Those of you who know the soundtrack, who know the musical, know that this is Aaron Burr's advice to Hamilton that resonates throughout. Talk less, smile more. Don't let people know what you're for, right? You can sing it. I didn't get it quite right. But Franklin's silence is Aaron Burr's silence, right? Don't talk so much. Don't let people know what you're thinking. From Franklin's point of view, it's so you can help it negotiate or help to arbitrate a dispute between people, and so you can move more effectively between them. Burr's motivations are similar, but in the musical they're different. But you see that Hamilton actually, as you think about it, takes this tension that I'm talking about and dramatizes it. Hamilton is impulsive. He talks too much. He just keeps producing information. He keeps saying what he thinks. He can't help saying what he thinks. And his tension with Burr, as it's described in the musical and the book that precedes it, is that Burr refuses to say what he thinks. He refuses to commit to his ideas, whereas Hamilton can't help but do it. And as we reflect on silence in this way, I think we're left back at that point of how do we, and I've started to wonder, is Franklin's silence, Burr's silence, the tactical silence, is that also in some ways marked with privilege? Is that the silence that I can afford to not speak because I know that I can participate in this conversation down the road. I know that I can steer it. Do we need to, when thinking about Franklin's advice around this, do we need to leaven that with the idea of, yes, withholding yourself out of a conversation to not speak, and maybe even to listen. Notice Franklin's silence is not about listening, although in a way it is. What he's saying is, don't speak unless it advances your interests or someone else's. Don't talk frivolously. What that means is, you could say, well, Franklin's telling you to listen to people as opposed to just talking all the time. But he doesn't say that. He's saying, just wait, wait your time. Is there sort of the mark of privilege on that? And I think that's another thing for us to think about. Again, I feel like we are in a moment now where, especially this day, this week, is a time when we are all feeling acutely this sort of stress around our government, our politics. And the idea of sort of sitting back and being silent and watching it is something I can't encourage you to do. And yet, but yet we also are in a season and in a moment where there's so much noise, so much chatter, this relentless talking that we almost can't find silence if we want to. I put this up here just because it's a little out of order, but I was thinking about Franklin the diplomat. When Franklin was negotiating the Peace of Paris and negotiating the end to the Revolutionary War, it was precisely this ability to let other people speak, to sit back, let others say their piece, and to step in at the right moment that made him, in some ways, such an effective diplomat. Also understanding his French patrons better than... The contrast between him and John Adams is famous historically. Adams was, loud and entitled. Franklin was much more charming. So I guess that's what I have to leave you with here, is just this set of meditations on the challenges of silence. That on the one hand, we have this urgent need we all feel for rest, for silence in a world that is so cacophonous, it's so noisy, that in order to just keep ourselves together and keep our thoughts organized, we need that peace. We have Franklin's idea of silence, which is really it will advance you in the world. It will help your relationships with other people if you don't talk needlessly, but instead wait until what you're saying really is the most advantageous to you and to others. But then we also have this problem associated with that, which is good people need to speak. In a republic, in a democracy, in any kind of society, good people need to speak up. And where is that more vivid to us than around, again, the Me Too movement, or the whistleblower who spoke about the Ukraine phone call and has changed our course of our history. I guess the place probably to end is by bringing it back a little bit to the season. Those of you from Christian backgrounds know this is Advent. And the whole deal with Advent is you're waiting for the arrival of Jesus. And that is a time of silence and a time of waiting, a time of appreciating also this moment of quiet in nature. You don't hear a lot of birds this time of year. And I love this. I especially love sunrises and sunsets that come so close together at this time of year. And I suppose with that, and as I started to think about that idea, that Advent is paradoxically, it's the same paradox wrapped in the middle. It's spiritually or religiously supposed to be a time of waiting and silence and peace, but there isn't any more noisy time on the calendar in terms of our lives, in terms of commerce and all of this. And at the center of it is the birth of Jesus, which becomes this dynamic moment that comes out of the silence. And maybe that's a way of thinking about this moment of the silence that then breaks out into a moment of freedom and of change at the center of it. So, silent night. Have a good silent night. Have a good silent town of Bethlehem. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you for letting me speak to you today. And I'm happy to take any questions.